Hi everyone, and welcome to another of our midweek devotions. This week we are looking at the first three verses of Psalm 107. So grab a Bible and turn to Psalm 107, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 3. Psalm 107, verse 1 to 3. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. In verse 1, we are given the purpose of the psalm to encourage us to give thanks to the Lord, and also the reason why we should give thanks. For he is good, his love endures forever. And the rest of the psalm that we don't have time to read gives us examples of God's goodness and enduring love. Verse 3 gives us a strong clue that this psalm was written after God's people returned from exile, where they were scattered to the north, the south, the east, and the west. But as we know from when we studied Ezra last year, God brought his people back from exile and back to the land that he had given them. And so in verse 2, the writer urges his first readers to tell their story. That is, those who had been redeemed, those who had been brought back to the land of Judah, to tell their story of God's goodness and that his love endures forever. See, when God's people went into exile, it was God's judgment upon them for their rejection of him as the one true God. And many of the exiles maybe thought, that's it, we've blown it. God has abandoned us, he has rejected us. But the fact that God redeemed them, he brought them back, proved that God's love endures forever for his people. And so the psalmist wants the people to share their stories of God's goodness and love. And in the rest of the psalm, which you might want to read later, we read different stories and circumstances of people who God redeemed, but they all did the same thing. Verse 6, verse 13, verse 19, and verse 28, we read, they cried to the Lord in their trouble. And they all experienced the same thing when they did that. God brought them out of their distress, the verses say. And so the psalmist wants them all to respond in the same way. Verse 8, verse 15, verse 21, verse 31, give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. But it's not just a psalm for Israelites who were redeemed from exile. This is a psalm for Christians like us to join in with. Each one of us has been redeemed. We haven't been taken off to live in a foreign land and brought back by God geographically. We have been brought back from Satan's house, as we saw in Jesus' parable from Mark chapter 3 a couple of weeks ago. Jesus, the strong man, bound Satan and took from his house sinners like you and me. The redemption came at a price. Jesus' own death was how Satan was bound and sinners were freed. And we saw in Mark 3 that we were not just taken from Satan's house and let loose. We are gathered into God's family. Have a look at verse 6. It says, the people, then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. If we are a Christian, that has happened to each one of us. At some point, we recognized that we were in trouble because of our sin. We were distressed by it. And so we cried out to the Lord, Lord, save me. Lord, forgive me. And because of his goodness and enduring love shown to us in the Lord Jesus Christ and his death at Calvary, he redeemed us, he delivered us, he saved us. Although we were all saved through the same means, Jesus' death and resurrection, we all have a different story to tell of how and when we were redeemed. Some first heard about Jesus at the gym, others at a football tournament, or a funeral, or playing Pokemon, or in Sunday school, or just turning up to church. So many stories of God's work of redeeming, of bringing people into his family. And the psalm also mentions the locations of where people were gathered and brought back. In our church, we are well represented in terms of north, south, east and west. Sandra way up in the north in Scotland. South, well, Holly's from Sheffield. That's about as far as we'll go. West, Sharon is from Wales. East, if you talk to Peter Jacob, he'll tell you that he lived right by the seaside on the northeast coast. God has gathered us from the lands to be part of his redeemed people together at St. Andrews. And each one of us has a story to tell about his goodness and enduring love towards us. So I wonder, when was the last time that you told your story? Have you ever told it? I know it's difficult at the moment for us to meet together, but I know that some of us are meeting in gardens or parks or even homes. Well, next time that you do, why not agree to tell your stories to one another? I absolutely love having those conversations. It's such a thrill to hear about God's goodness and enduring love to his people. Sharing our stories should make the Christian who hears the story want to praise and give thanks to God, which is what we all should be wanting, more praise and thanks to God, just as the psalmist encourages us to do in verse 1. Sharing our story with Christians will also help us as we look to share God's goodness and love with non-Christians. A few weeks ago, when we looked at Jesus calling his first disciples, I mentioned how it can be helpful when we speak to non-Christians about Jesus to be able to answer the question, how did you become a Christian? Or how come you go to church? What do you think of Jesus? If we have shared our story of how we became a Christian with a Christian friend, we will be ready to share our story with a non-Christian friend. We'll be confident to do it. If you already know how others in your home group or your mates at church became a Christian, their stories, then there's more we can do with this storytelling. God's redeeming and loving goodness doesn't stop when we become Christians. I love the phrase in verse 1 that his love endures forever. It just goes on and on. It doesn't peak when we become a Christian and then gradually decline. It endures, it lasts. And recently we were with some Christian friends and we spent some time sharing how God had helped us through a particular time of trouble or distress, or how he had helped us in a battle with sin. Each person had some verses or a passage from the Bible that was really precious to them, that had really helped them and encouraged them. And as I listened, it was so encouraging to hear about God and how he had used his powerful word to help his people through times of suffering, or had helped them in their battle with sin. These conversations are so sweet. It really helped us to get to know our friends even better. And more importantly, they showed me and Ruth more of God's goodness, more of his enduring love, and gave us more reasons to turn to him in praise and thanks. The psalm was written to be sung as a community, and for all individuals who had been redeemed to sing it together. And I know for many of us that's what we're greatly missing about singing with the church family, looking around and seeing all the different faces from north, south, east and west in our church family, all with different stories of God's redeeming love and goodness, giving praise and thanks to our great God who has redeemed us. And as we listen to one another's stories more and more, and I encourage you to do it in the coming weeks, it will encourage you greatly, I promise. It will deepen our friendships with one another, and it will give us more reason to join in with the psalmist in verse 1 as he declares, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." Now, I haven't done any questions or prayer points this week because I just want to encourage us to tell our story to another Christian this week. It might be something you could do now with people that you live with, either how you became a Christian or how God helped you through a really difficult time. Make sure that God is at the center of the story, and so it leaves the other person pondering the loving deeds of the Lord, as the psalm ends in verse 43, and wanting to give thanks to the Lord, as we've seen in verse 1. then pray. Use verse 1 as a launch pad of praise and ask for God's help to encourage others with stories of the Lord's enduring love and goodness, and also help in sharing that love and goodness with those who don't yet know him.